My name is Brittany Newton, and I teach 5th grade here at Faith Lutheran of Plano. I attended Concordia University in Chicago, where I got my elementary education degree and a theology degree. And currently I am attending the University of Dallas in their humanities program, working towards a certification in classical education. Because a liberal arts education is repetitious, rhythmic, and poetic, I'm going to begin with my students' favorite poem, a portion of G.K. Chesterton's Lepanto. White founts falling in the courts of the sun, and the Sultan of Byzantium is smiling as they run. There is laughter like the fountains in that face of all men feared. It stirs the forest darkness, the darkness of his beard. It curls the blood-red crescent, the crescent of his lips. For the inmost sea of all the earth is shaken with his ships. They have dared the white republics of the capes of Italy. They have dashed the Adriatic round the lion of the sea. And the Pope has cast his arms abroad for agony and loss, and called the kings of Christendom for swords about the cross. The cold Queen of England is looking in the glass. The shadow of the Valois is yawning at the mass. From evening isles fantastical rings faint the Spanish gun, and the Lord upon the golden horn is laughing in the sun. Dim drums throbbing in the hills half heard, where only on a nameless throne a crownless prince has stirred, where risen from a doubtful seat in half a tainted stall, the last knight of Europe takes weapons from the wall, the last and lingering troubadour to whom the bird has sung, that once went singing southward when all the world was young. In that enormous silence, tiny and unafraid, comes up along the winding road the noise of the crusade. Strong gongs groaning as the guns boom far. Don John of Austria is going to the war. In the gloom black purple, in the glint old gold, torchlight crimson on the copper kettle drums, then the tuckets, then the trumpets, then the cannon, and he comes. Don John laughing in the brave beard curled, spurning of his stirrups like the thrones of all the world. Holding his head up for the flag of all the free, love light of Spain, hurrah, death light of Africa, Don John of Austria is riding to the sea. Hopefully that with your coffee gave you a little bit of burst of energy this morning, feeling a little of the martial spirit of the liberal arts. And I don't consider myself a Chestertonian, but I am going to continue with another section of Chesterton this morning as we consider the discipline of history. This comes from Chesterton's Orthodoxy on tradition. Tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. Old Democrats object to men being disqualified by the accident of birth. Tradition objects to men being disqualified by the accident of death. Democracy tells us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our groom. Tradition asks us not to neglect a good man's opinion, even if he is our father. I, at any rate, cannot separate the two ideas of democracy and tradition. It seems evident to me that they are the same idea. We will have the dead at our councils. The ancient Greeks voted by stones. These shall vote by tombstones. It is all quite regular and official, for most tombstones, like most ballot papers, are marked with a cross. In the discipline of history, tradition is our content. We get to hear the voices of the past, those stories of the people who have formed us. A liberal arts education is repetitious, rhythmic, and poetic. Our days have certain rhythms to them in the classroom. Our weeks have certain rhythms to them in the classroom. And in our classroom, every week, we start with this rhythm. You are here in Plano, Texas in 2018 at Faith Lutheran School. And how did you get to this point? We're going to go over several events that formed and shaped the way that we got here today to Faith Lutheran School. In 1971, the United States was in the middle of the Vietnam War, and at that time, the people of Faith Lutheran Church determined that they wanted a school in order that they might help parents raise up Christian children. In 1971, FLS began. On December 7, 1941, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called it a date that would live in infamy as the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into World War II. 4 years later, in 1945, after the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States and our allies would be successful, bringing an end to World War II. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president of our country, and as a result, the southern states seceded from the Union, concerned about his stance on slavery. A year later, in 1861, the American Civil War began. President Lincoln said during that war, during his Gettysburg Address, "It is for us the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." And in 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, General Robert E. Lee and General Ulysses S. Grant did indeed realize that the Union was preserved at the end of the American Civil War. Just 20 years prior to the American Civil War, another event important to us here at Faith Lutheran Plano, in 1836, Texas received independence from Mexico and was its own republic until 1845, when it became a part of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson, with the help of others, wrote the Declaration of Independence, and in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed, and America was born. A little over 100 years prior to the Declaration of Independence, there were already men from Europe who were making their way to the New World. In 1620, Miles Standish and the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth. The colony that would be formed in Plymouth, Massachusetts would be one that would be centered on the Puritan church, the church being the center of the colony, and also would have education as a primary focus. So from our very beginning, even before the United States was a country, when we were yet colonies of Britain, education was already a primary focus. 1607, the Jamestown colony was founded. This too was founded by Englishmen, John Smith and others from England, came to Jamestown in Virginia and settled a colony. It would be different than the colony in Massachusetts. They would figure out that they could cultivate tobacco, and that would be how the colony survived. But this great difference between Jamestown, Virginia, and Massachusetts would be one of the separations in our country that would eventually lead to what happens here 200 years later with the American Civil War. The seeds for the differences between North and South were already apparent way back then. Salvation unto us has come by God's free grace and favor. Good works cannot avert our doom. They help and save us never. Faith looks to Jesus Christ alone, who did for all the world atone. He is our one Redeemer. Yet, as the law must be fulfilled, or we must die despairing, Christ came and has God's anger stilled, our human nature sharing. He has for us the law obeyed, and thus the Father's vengeance stayed, which over us impended. Since Christ has full atonement made and brought to us salvation, each Christian therefore may be glad and build on this foundation. Your grace alone, dear Lord, I plead. Your death is now my life indeed, for you have paid my ransom. Let me not doubt, but truly see, your word cannot be broken. Your call rings out, come unto me, no falsehood have you broken. Baptized into your precious name, my faith cannot be put to shame, and I shall never perish. Faith alone, grace alone, scripture alone, Christ alone. These were the doctrines that came out of the Reformation, which was begun in 1517. While the Reformation had political effects, educational effects, of course, we at Faith Lutheran School appreciate the doctrines that have now stood for the last 500 years as a result of the work that was done during the Reformation. In 1492, the Renaissance has encouraged exploration, and people are looking for a new route to India and China. And they're going by way of the sea, around the east, around Africa, to get to India and China. But Columbus is going to take the waters less traveled, and that is going to make all of the difference. Columbus is going to sail to the New World in 1492, and as a result, encourage others to do the same. The Western Roman Empire had fallen 1,000 years prior, but the Eastern Roman Empire had survived in Constantinople. However, in 1453, Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople. As a result of this, many of the Christians in Constantinople fled to the West, brought with them their study of Greek, which allowed for the Renaissance to continue to flourish in Western Europe. The cry in 1776 of the people to their mother country was, the people have rights, the government's power ought to be limited. The people have rights, the government's power ought to be limited. The people have rights. Those Englishmen knew that because 500 years before, a similar cry had been spoken of those in England during the reign of King John. King John was a terrible, no good, awful, very bad king, and the people revolted against him and had him sign the Magna Carta, which was the statement that said, the people have rights, the government's power must be limited. The people have rights, the government's power must be limited. 500 years later, that is going to be very important to our founding documents. For 476 AD, the fall of Rome. Fall of Rome led us into the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval times, where we had the opportunity for the church to grow in power and influence. As the Roman Empire fell, essentially the empire of the church grew large. The Roman Empire had been persecuting Christians for quite some time, but in 313 AD, under Emperor Constantine, the Edict of Milan happened, and Christianity was made legal. So Christianity could then spread throughout the Roman Empire, and the seeds of Christianity that would become the church that would grow powerful, that would eventually influence much of who we are today, began here. In In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria, and everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. And there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night. An angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid. I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord." In 3 BC, we have God entering human history as the man Jesus Christ. So this is what I would go through with my students once a week. And I do this for a number of reasons. For one thing, obviously this is not an extensive, there are lots of events that have happened that are not listed on this timeline, nothing even prior to the birth of Christ. And of course, there are a lot of important events that happened before that. I tend to focus a lot on the American tradition, as that's where our history section is particularly focused. But even within America, I don't have all of our, I don't have every major event that's listed. What I've wanted to do is kind of pare down these events to something that's manageable, that can be memorized easily, and so that students can have sort of some points that they can arrange the rest of events that they study throughout history on. So then when they hear that something happened in the 1500s, then they know that it's around the time of the Renaissance, that it's close to the Reformation, that kind of thing. I purposely always begin in 2018 and work backwards, just like I did. I do that in a way to show how students are impacted by these events. And at times we can talk about the how each of those things have to do with why they are here, why we are here today in 2018, how each one of these listed here have influenced us particularly. I would like to talk about these events in regard to our students' vocations. So when they think of their lives as members of the church, they can see how the events on this timeline influence them as members of the church. Of course, the fact that this is not merely a myth that Jesus came to earth, but that this in fact did happen in human history. God himself comes to earth in the man Jesus Christ, dies on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins, rises again. That has to do with their vocation as members of the church. Of course, all that happened in the Reformation has to do with their vocation as members of the church, that they too might know that grace alone, scripture alone, faith alone, Christ alone, that they might know the truth of those things themselves, and that they might also then share that with others too. And then, of course, from a personal setting, then we can talk about our own church and school and how that affects us today. We can talk about their vocation as citizens, both of our country and of our particular state. And we can see all of these events as being part of their vocation. Again, as we mentioned with the Magna Carta, that has to do with their Americanness, that they understand the rights of the people. The limited power of the government is a right that they have that comes all the way back here 700 years before, nearly 800 years before they were born. When we can talk about the colonization and how that has to do with their citizenship, how the importance of education and the church, how those things influence who they are as citizens of America. The rights that they have given to them in the Declaration and our other founding documents have to do with who they are as citizens of our country. And then the way that our union has been preserved throughout wars in our history also influences their life as citizens of the United States. And of course, as Texans too, then they see themselves particularly as citizens of our state and see the particular history that we have of becoming a state, being part of the South in the American Civil War, and again, that we have been preserved through this time. And then they can see themselves as students in their vocation as student and see themselves as heir to the fact that Faith Lutheran Church thought it was important for them to have an education, that the founders found it important for them to have an education, that the colonists did as well, that the rebirth and revival of Greek text has to do with why they are here at a classical Lutheran school. So they can see themselves in light of these different vocations. I think that it's important. I like this timeline because it allows students to ask why these different events are important and allows them to see what it has to do with them in particular. I can remember, I'm dating myself, I suppose. You can tell exactly how old I am. But in 2001, I was in 8th grade. And so I remember that my 8th grade year opened up with the terrorist attacks on September 11th. And for me, that was sort of, I had always enjoyed studying history, but for me, that was sort of a moment to understand this is, that's something, that day that was going to be something that would be written down in history books. And now as a teacher to students who weren't alive in 2001, I talk about that as a historical event. And so that's sort of poignant to me, but this I like because then it shows how that's something similar too, how all of these things are a part of who we are and shape us in a particular way. And something that I have appreciated seeing students do too, when we then go on to study other events in history, then they're accustomed to asking that question. Well, what would have happened if Columbus didn't sail to the New World? How would have that affected us? And so they get used to asking that question. What does this have to do with why we are here? Why are we studying this? And it kind of gives us a good context to talk about that. There are many ways, of course, that this could be used. I particularly have chosen these events, but that doesn't mean that is the only way that needs to be. I, again, have used just the ones from the United States mostly. We've kind of focused on that, but there could be much said prior to that and other ways that can be used. For my students, we go through this in a lot of ways. A lot of times I'll just go through the timeline the way I did just now. Sometimes I have the students race to see how quickly they can put up the timeline. The current record is 3 minutes and 45 seconds. Sometimes I have them draw pictures of these events. Sometimes I'll take more time on them than others. Sometimes it's just a quick review. But some way that I like to have it in front of their face once a week so that as they move on further towards middle school, high school, and college, and they have this as sort of their timeline that's always ingrained in their head. Again, a liberal arts education is repetitious, rhythmic, and poetic. And so I'd like to share one last poem. Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast and our eternal home. Under the shadow of thy throne, thy saints have dwelt secure. Sufficient is thine arm alone, and our defense is sure. Before the hills in order stood, or earth received her frame, from everlasting thou art God, to endless years the same. 1,000 ages in thy sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, soon bears us all away. We fly forgotten as a dream, dies at the opening day. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, be thou our guard while life shall last, and our eternal home. All right, are there any comments? Yes.
About your timeline.
Yes.
Do you go over the course of the year? Do you deal specifically with each event? And do you add things to the timeline as the year goes on? And is it always the same every week? Is it always the same events, or do those ever change?
Yes, this is what I start with from the very beginning. The particular history that we study in 5th grade starts from exploration and goes until just after like 1812. But I do this every week sort of in addition to that. And then when we come up with, other events that have happened, I don't add them to the weekly timeline, but I do talk about, now this of course would be right after 1620. So we know that as when the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth. I find it helpful then because by the time we get to 1776, they've already been talking about that for, because that's towards the end of our school year. So they've already been talking about that for a long time, and they're already sort of familiar with that. And then I also hope, it doesn't give a whole lot of context, but at least we have a few events prior to the point that we study to give us a starting point. Yes.
In the section that you study more heavily for fifth grade, do you incorporate math work, geography, literature, like some of the things that you were reading to us today, or how do you incorporate kind of some of the things that tie into history outside of the timeline of history itself and the facts? Yes,
we study the geography in incorporation with what the events are that we're studying. And so especially in exploration, the different places that the explorers are going to, then we have a map to study where those things were. So that always goes, those things always go together. We study literature, and particularly primary sources that come from these particular events. That's sort of our basis. We try to give some background on those primary sources, but that is what we want to be the basis of what we're teaching from, is the primary sources. For literature, we should probably do a better job of that. For it's fifth grade is still, they're still sort of a little young for some of the great works that they could be reading there. So hopefully by the time they get older, then they can be reading some of those works. We tend to read some of the works that they've been rewritten, so they're familiar with the stories of some great works like the Iliad, Odyssey, those types of things, Canterbury Tales, so that by the time that they're in high school, then they can know the storyline and read the real deal.
So you're teaching fifth grade, you put the timeline up, and you have your set years that you're going to teach for fifth grade specifically. But when you write the Magna Carta, you say that affected the Declaration of Independence. Do you ever read the Magna Carta in the fifth grade, or tell them what it says?
Yes, we will read a part of it when we get to the Declaration of Independence, and we do read some sections of it. Yes, we don't. Yes. Yes.
Okay, and this is how we do.
Yes, and we read Robin Hood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, and that gives us a good. It helps us understand why we hate King John. Yeah. Yes.
I guess I'm wondering, at what time during the school year do they have these down, memorized in their head? And also, have you had any conversations with sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade teachers? Does it carry through, or?
Yeah, we should do that. Have conversations with the sixth grade teacher. They will probably, it's not something that I have said you must have this memorized, so they're actually never tested on it. It's just something that we do every week. And so they're pretty, of course it depends on the student too, but probably in the first, maybe 2 months, because it's once a week, and so it's not as frequent, probably a couple months, then they can start recognizing those. And then I will put up, I'll do it reverse. So I'd put up the date and they tell me what happened, or I put up what happened and they tell me the date, and so we kind of go back and forth that way. I'm still relatively new at the school, so will only be my third year teaching here, but that would be something good to work on, is seeing how that can continue through, so that their teachers know that they should already know these things. Yes.
And ask the other side of that, and that is, do they have any exposure to that before they come to your class in fifth grade?
Yes. They start in second grade with the ancients. In third grade, then they do more study of like Greece and Rome, and then they study medieval history in fourth grade. So they've already seen. By the time they get to me, they've already seen this part.
Okay, so they have seen the time. That's been presented in a timeline, you know?
We use the Veritas curriculum, and so they have they're familiar with the events, particularly from the songs that the Veritas curriculum has. They can all sing to you. Then came the end of the Roman Empire, 476 AD.
Your primary sources, are those things that you pull out, or are they part of your curriculum? How do you incorporate those in your classes?
There are some that are part of our curriculum. Some of them are, the ones that they present to us are very difficult, so I will either take a portion of it or spend a lot of time talking about background on it. Sometimes I do add others as well. There are a lot that are available online. It depends on what I want. They do offer, the Veritas curriculum, I think, does offer a lot that you can choose from, but they do tend to be, you can't just hand it to a 10-year-old and say, read that and understand it. So we have to spend a lot of time going through what it means.
Are there particular primary sources to this period that you teach and you find particularly accessible to fifth grade or helpful to fifth grade?
We read the whole Declaration. We read much of the Constitution as well. We read journals from the explorers that are helpful when we're talking about exploration. And same thing with the colonies too. We read some of their the journals that they write. Those tend to be easier than the official government documents to read.
I just missed it. When you said classical education was repetitious, something, and poetic.
Rhythmic and poetic. Yes.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.